Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton just can't seem to shake the corruption charges that have been following her for years, maybe even decades. But in Washington, Hillary's checkered past is rarely mentioned anymore, although her past transgressions should have been enough to prevent her from becoming Secretary of State in the first place. Yet, since Washington is only unforgiving to truth-tellers, she headed the State Department until recently. Amid all the talk about Obamacare, the nation sometimes forgets that as First Lady, Hillary simply gave herself political authority and met behind closed doors to devise Hillary Care. Hillary Care was an earlier attempt at socializing the American medical system. And in order to become a U.S. Senator, Hillary carpetbagged from Arkansas to New York State and took up residence there. She did so just in the nick of time in order to hang on to power after her husband, President Bill Clinton, finished his 2 terms as president. He gave America the beloved North American Free Trade Agreement. NAFTA has continued to ravage the economy long after the Clintons have left the White House. Fast forward to today, internal government documents now show that Hillary waived restrictions on U.S. financial aid to Afghanistan. The problem is that Hillary's fingerprints are all over the fact that the waivers allowed millions of tax dollars to line the pockets of corrupt Afghan organizations. According to today's Washington Times, top officials at the U.S. Agency for International Development repeatedly cited former Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton for setting into motion a policy to waive restrictions on who could receive U.S. financial aid in Afghanistan, resulting in millions of dollars in U.S. funds going directly into the coffers of Afghan ministries known to be rife with corruption. The U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID for short, is the government's key foreign aid conduit. The Times adds that references to Hillary's role in this matter first appeared in a November 2012 USAID action memo. That memo showed that U.S. officials made a strategic foreign aid decision 2 years before that to provide at least 50% of U.S. financial aid directly to the Afghan government. And according to the documentation, in July of 2010, Secretary of State Clinton reaffirmed the arrangement. Her waiver served to justify why the organization USAID cast aside rules that otherwise would have required the agency to first assess the risks of providing such aid. The funds were vulnerable to waste, fraud, or outright theft. Furthermore, then Secretary of State Clinton knew about but apparently covered up the clear dangers at the U.S. consulate in Benghazi, Libya. That was before the September 2012 attack on the consulate, which resulted in the death of U.S. Ambassador Christopher Stevens. However, in Washington, constitutional rules are the first thing to be ignored, regardless of whether U.S. aid guidelines or other agency rules are broken. Nowhere does the U.S. Constitution give the federal government the authority to financially prop up other nations. With America's roads, bridges, key waterways, and other infrastructure gravely in need of repairs, the U.S. aid agency is requesting just over $20 billion in foreign aid for the fiscal year of 2015. And revealingly, that agency's website logo states, U.S. aid from the American people. Given all that has happened on Hillary's watch, critics are bound to question why, of all things, she evidently intends to run for president in 2016. But what's equally or more troubling is how loose the United States government is with taxpayer dollars, when our domestic economy cries out for a government devoted to America, not nation building overseas.